Hello, and welcome to the Cultivo Podcast, where we talk about the science, finance, technology, and people building landscape resilience at speed and scale. I'm Sean Leslie, and today I'm here with Mary Cvetkovic-Jones, Cultivo's soil scientist. Mary is an expert in soil carbon, biogeochemistry, and grassland ecology, and she's focused on grassland ecosystems for nearly 8 years. She holds a PhD in soil science from Lancaster University. And at Cultivo, she leads the design and implementation of comprehensive soil processes for our nature-based projects worldwide. Welcome, Mary.
Thanks, Sean.
Great to have you here. We won't let on that you and I practiced this beforehand, so I won't say back. But anyway, you're an expert in soil and grasslands, and because of that, you're a great person to talk about soil and grasslands. Why they are so important, why their ecological health is so important, and why we work on grassland regeneration projects around the world here at Cultivo. But first of all, I'm wondering if you can tell me what is a surprising or overlooked species that you think plays a pivotal role in landscape health?
That's a really nice question, and Sean, and I think I'm a little bit biased with my response here, both because of soil and also with a lot of my previous research being based in Southern Africa, because I would say my surprising and perhaps a little bit overlooked species is termites. So termites are these incredible bioengineers, ecosystem engineers, and they have the ability to build these large structures above ground that we can see above ground. But within these structures, they also have these large networks below ground. And they often get these nicknames of being bioengineers and ecosystem engineers because of this remarkable ability to transform their environments in ways that not only benefit their colonies, but also the ecosystems they inhabit. So yeah, they're these kind of architectural marvels if you cut them down the middle, and they create stable microenvironments that have controlled humidity, controlled temperature, and if we're just looking at just the impact they have on the soil, they help improve soil structure. They have an important role in soil carbon cycling, biodiversity support, nutrient cycling. And their influence is often really prominent and pronounced in nutrient poor and dry environments where them turning over the soil and building these structures has a really big impact. And sometimes the kind of presence of termites can mean the difference between kind of degradation and desertification and almost thriving biodiversity. So I always think termites are one of the unsung heroes of the soil in a lot of particularly more arid, nutrient poor locations. So yeah, I'm going to go with termites.
And I've seen some pictures recently of those mounds you were talking about, and they look like they get to be 10, 15 feet tall, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's like a whole range of different mounds you can get. Some are really big and some are actually really small. And sometimes when we've been sampling projects near termite mounds, we almost just have to avoid termite mounds because they become such nutrient hotspots and they change the soil ecosystem so much just around them that it begins to, if we're not looking at termites, it begins to really influence our data collection. So we sometimes have to leave them alone. But yeah, they're really incredible.
That's fascinating. And talking about soil, you're a soil scientist. What is it that makes soil so important? I know talking to you that you talk about soil being really the basis of a healthy ecosystem. And so why is that? And why is soil so important when it comes to maintaining that sort of ecosystem resilience?
Yeah, exactly. Just what you said, Sean, really. Like soil is the foundation of life and of ecosystems. Soil supports plant life. It enhances biodiversity, provides a whole host of essential ecosystem services. And there's a whole range of ecosystem services. Obviously, one of those is carbon sequestration. So soils can store more carbon than the atmosphere and vegetation combined. So they're hugely important carbon sinks. And they're key players in nutrient cycling. They break down organic matter, provide essential nutrients to the plant. They can filter and store water. If you've got healthy soil, you can reduce that flood risk. You can replenish groundwater. You can have strong drought resilience. And one of the difficulties we see with soil, I think, is because you can't see what is happening as clearly below ground, we assume a lot of that isn't happening. But for example, a teaspoon of soil, in some cases, can have more microorganisms than there are people on Earth. So a teaspoon of soil can have billions of microorganisms. And these microbes drive those processes of nutrient cycling and plant health and disease resistance. So what's happening below the soil is really driving ecosystem health, and soil connects all these kind of different ecosystem services. We could go on with the list, and that's all required for a healthy ecosystem. But I think in reverse, it's also important to remember that soil is finite. In terms of the geology of soil, it takes hundreds and thousands of years to form, but it can be eroded and destroyed in a matter of decades through erosion or pollution or poor land management. And that is a big worry because soil health is directly linked to all these ecosystem services. So when soil degrades, crop yields decline, desertification spreads, degradation happens, things like food security are threatened because if you can't grow your crops to feed your livestock in the soil, food security becomes threatened. And I think that there's lots of different values out there depending how you define degradation. But I think more than 30% of the world's soils are already degraded at least. And these healthy soils are what are vital for climate resilience. So healthy soils influence the local and the global climate. They regulate things like heat exchange, water retention, carbon storage. So all within the earth, they help manage so many of the different ecosystem processes. So I guess going back to your question, without healthy soil, healthy ecosystems and a healthy planet don't actually exist. And without soil in reality, ecosystems begin to collapse. And soil really is at the foundation of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm remembering learning about the Dust Bowl and that kind of stuff in the United States. And I think various aspects of weather and monoculture cropping and that kind of stuff all contributed to that, as you said. One of the things you mentioned there was soil's ability to store carbon dioxide and pulling it out of the atmosphere and locking it into organic matter. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that works?
Yeah, of course. So we have there's our big carbon cycle that we can draw out on a piece of paper, but what we're interested in terms of soil carbon sequestration is how do we get the carbon in the atmosphere and the air into the soil? And the first step of that is photosynthesis. So the classic photosynthesis equation that you learn at school, plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from the air, and they convert it into organic carbon through photosynthesis. And so some of this carbon stays in the plant, in the shoots and the roots, but a lot of it enters the soil through the roots or through leaf litter or through the plant, decomposing plant material. And so once that carbon is then in the soil, we often call that organic material, that gets broken down by microbes. So bacteria, fungi, decomposers. So the carbon begins to be broken down. And some of that carbon actually gets cycled back into the atmosphere. And this isn't a bad thing. This is just the microbes respiring. So like you and I, when the microbes breathe, they breathe out carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide is returned to the atmosphere through microbial respiration. But some of it gets stabilized in the soil. And this is where carbon can get locked away for decades, centuries, millennia. And when I was doing my PhD, one of my professors had a really nice analogy for this, which was to do with your checking account and your savings account. So the short-term carbon in the soils is our checking accounts. And this is fast-moving carbon. So it's found in the fresh plant residues, something we call root exudates, and also the microbial biomass. So the microbes that are there in the soil are also made up of carbon. And so this cycles quickly. Plants deposit carbon in the soil through photosynthesis, and microbes withdraw it as they break it down for energy. And like we were saying, respire the carbon dioxide back in. And so just like a checking account, this carbon is constantly moving, but it is critical to have that checking account and that carbon moving for the soil ecosystems functioning. But then we also have our savings account. So a portion of your monthly wage is going through the checkings account, but a portion of it wants to go into your saving account. And that's our long-term carbon. And that's what we're interested in. And so this is the carbon that gets locked away. It's bound to minerals. It forms stable compound. It becomes something that we call humus, which is part of the soil. And this is your savings account. Not being spent straight away. It shouldn't be spent straight away. And it should be stored for the long haul. And this is sometimes, hopefully, centuries, depending on many different factors in the soil is the time it is stored in the soil. And this kind of savings account is what makes soil one of the largest terrestrial sinks on Earth. But when our soil is disturbed, so through any reason, through desertification, through erosion, intensive tillage, overgrazing, they lose both the short-term and the long-term carbon. So it's like draining both your checkings and your savings account at the same time. And it leaves the system empty and sending more carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But if the soil is healthy and well managed, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and we're constantly depositing carbon into both our checking and savings. And so we've got both the healthy checkings and both a healthy savings account. And that is important for the soil functioning.
That's a really great analogy and makes it super easy to understand. But I think after we're done here, I'm going to go check my savings account. Something that caught in there that we've talked about a little bit in the past is the importance of roots when it comes to carbon storage, particularly in grasslands. And I understand that grasslands store a huge amount of carbon like forests, but they do it in a different way. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of roots, like I say, they play a critical role in carbon sequestration in that they act as that major pathway for transferring carbon from the atmosphere and the air into the soil. And while we often think of kind of trees storing the carbon in their leaves and their stems and their trunk, a significant portion of the plant-derived carbon does actually end up below ground, which it can remain in your savings account, remaining there for a very long time. And so this has this kind of mechanisms of the roots, and soil organic carbon can have great positive effects for soil carbon storage, because deeper storage means less exposure to disturbance. And unlike plants and leaves that can decompose quickly and release carbon dioxide, when carbon's stored in deep roots and soil layers, it's better protected. And roots can also help form soil aggregates, so that physically protects the carbon from being broken down by microbes. The microbes can't physically get to the carbon, and the microbial interactions that also happen with kind of root-derived carbon can be quite complex. And this means you can have very chemically stable compounds that remain in the soil for long periods of time. Like you say, this is really important with grasslands, as grasslands store 90% of their carbon below ground in the roots and soils. All these benefits that come with that apply to where carbon is stored in grasslands, say in comparison to forests.
And so speaking of grasslands, which is your area of expertise in addition to soil, you don't hear much about grasslands in our line of work in carbon sequestration and landscape regeneration. You hear more about forests. And I think that's understandable. Trees are a symbol of nature and regeneration and a healthy ecosystem. But why do you think, based on everything you said about grasslands and the soil and all that kind of stuff, why do you think grasslands maybe sometimes get overlooked?
Yeah, I think it's, grasslands often don't get as much attention, like you say, as forests and landscape regeneration, even though they do offer these kind of critical nature and ecosystem benefits. I think forests, like you say, are often thought of first because their carbon is almost visible. So trees are big, they're an above ground carbon sink. You can imagine the carbon that is stored in a tree. And like we've said before, grasslands, in contrast, store most of their carbon in the soil, and their impact is almost less visually obvious. You can't see the soil and you can't see the carbon in the soil. I think as well, I certainly learned more about trees and carbon storage, probably because of the fact that it's a very visual way to learn about it in school than I did about soil. I didn't learn a whole lot about soil, but I think perhaps this kind of lesser understanding of soil processes and how carbon can persist in the soil means that we overlook some of the benefits of grassland just due to that kind of lesser understanding of the processes. Forests are also great carbon sinks. They have different benefits, grasslands and forests. So grasslands often require less water than forest systems. So this can make them more drought resistant and resilient. And they have lots of different types of grass species, and these grass species are often well adapted to more arid conditions. If there is a drought, which which happens when the drought conditions subside. The kind of high plant biodiversity that we see in grasslands means that the grass and the soil can recover quite quickly. And this can reduce kind of the risk of carbon loss in terms of SOC, and also just maintaining ecosystem stability. Also, in the comparison of forests versus grasslands, fire adaptation in grasslands is a big benefit. Forest fires are very high intensity and woody biomass can burn for a very long time, whereas grasslands are well adapted to these frequent fires and they're very low severity fires. As you can imagine, with dry grass, the fire moves across the surface of the soil very fast. And because it burns through the grass very quickly, it doesn't actually give time for the temperature to penetrate into the soil. So the organic compounds, the organic carbon in the soil remains very protected. And in fact, frequent fires in grasslands in many places have been shown to be critical to soil functioning and can actually promote potential increases in soil organic carbon sequestration. That's really important. And I think what we've already touched on in the fact that grasslands just store a significant portion of their carbon below ground, primarily in the roots and in the soil. So it makes below ground carbon pools less vulnerable to above ground disturbances. So the roots and the soils, they're just better insulated from external stresses such as drought and fire. And then I think when we look at grasslands geographically, they're called lots of things all over the world. We've got grasslands, we've got rangelands, but in reality, grasslands actually cover 40% of the Earth's land area. So that means even if we can make small improvements in management and the amount of land cover means that we can actually sequester a lot of carbon by making small improvements across the 40%. And these improvements, there's lots of different land management improvements we can make to grasslands. And a lot of grasslands are rangelands and grazing lands. Managed grazing and improving grazing practices is one way that we can enhance soil carbon storage rather than seeing further land degradation in these ecosystems.
And so you talk about managing grasslands in a way that benefits their ecosystem services. You talked about biodiversity, you talked about storing carbon, filtering and storing water, all that kind of stuff. When you talk about well-managed grasslands, what does that look like? What do you mean when you say that?
Managed grasslands, yeah, it can be, there's lots of different ways that grasslands can be well managed. But one way, particularly in these rangelands where we have grazing, one way that we look at it is this kind of regenerative grazing and how can we change grazing practices. When managed properly, grazing can improve soil health, it can improve biodiversity, it can improve carbon storage. And historically, this is where we have to go back in time a bit and think, okay, so wild ruminants like bison, your antelope, your wildebeest, they moved in tight herds. So they grazed intensively before they moved on because they're moving across a landscape scale at this point, right? They're not just within a farm. And so this kind of pattern of grazing intensively and then moving on allows the grasses to recover. It allows the roots to grow deeper and it allows the manure to fertilize the soil, but then not to the point where there's too much manure and it's starting to interrupt the kind of nutrient cycling. So that kind of following that natural grazing behavior can create healthy, resilient grassland ecosystems. And we can actually apply this rotational grazing, regenerative grazing, holistic grazing as a modern livestock management strategy. And it mimics the natural grazing behavior. So instead of letting livestock graze continuously in one place, which can lead to overgrazing and land degradation, livestock can be rotated between pastures and paddocks, and this allows plants time to recover and soils to regenerate and the correct amount of manure to fertilize the soil. And this can lead to a whole host of improvements. Of studies have shown increased soil carbon storage. It can prevent soil erosion, evenly distributed manure rather than it all being distributed in one paddock and acts as a natural fertilizer. It can enhance microbial activity and making sure we're not degrading the land, supports climate resilience, supports drought resilience. healthier soils can then retain more moisture and it can keep paddocks productive for longer. So the farms can also begin to see the benefits.
So we talk about rotational grazing quite a bit in our projects around the world. And we have projects in North America, which are cattle and sheep, and we have projects in Africa, which I think are cattle and goats and things like that. As you said, these ruminants. But it sounds like that we adopt this technique both to regenerate the landscapes with our partners and the landowners and land workers, but also so that they have a revenue stream.
Yeah, absolutely. We do. This is a technique that we help to implement with many of our grassland projects, and the rotational grazing can have a big impact on the soil. Like we've talked about, it can have a good impact on the farms as well. And we don't just look at the grazing alone. We do look at a project basis at other things that might help. So we might also implement some water management infrastructure to help improve the soil moisture of the soil to really boost the productivity of those paddocks so that rotational grazing can be applied effectively. And it's really just important at every project to look at the science behind what we understand about that type of ecosystem, that soil type, that soil texture, that livestock type, the climate variables, and apply science at each project individually. But you're absolutely correct. We work under the broad umbrella of rotational grazing across a lot of our grassland projects.
Awesome. That's great to hear. I think as I speak to other experts in the space, we're going to learn more about rotational grazing and the socioeconomic impacts of that in later episodes of the podcast. But is there anything else, Mary, you wanted to talk about before we call it good and you end your day in England and I begin mine in Oregon?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered a lot. I think, I hope everyone can get on board with soil and is interested to learn a bit more about soil and the capabilities of soil and some of the challenges that also come with soil. So thanks for having me, Sean.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I know you're super busy and you're going to get back to work. Mary Cvetkovic-Jones, thank you very much for coming on the Cultivo Podcast. It's been a real pleasure. And with any luck, we'll talk to you again about some of our projects in the near future.
Thanks, Sean.